friends, it's Alice again, and we are also going to be reading Twits. We're going to be reading from The Glass Eye. If you didn't watch the video from yesterday, this is the next chapter from the Twits. Let's get started. The Glass Eye. You can play a lot of tricks with the glass eye because you can take it out and pop it back in again anytime you like. You can bet your life Mrs. Twit knew all the tricks. One morning she took out her glass eye and dropped it into Mr. Twit's mug of beer when he wasn't looking. Mr. Twit sat there drinking the beer slowly. The froth made a white ring around the hairs on his mouth. He wiped the white froth from his sleeve and wiped the sleeve on his trousers. "You're plotting something," Mrs. Twit said, keeping her back turned so she wouldn't see that she had taken out her glass eye. "Whenever you go all quiet like that, I know that you're plotting something." Mrs. Twit was right. Mr. Twit was plotting away like mad. He was trying to think of a really nasty trick he could play on that wife that day. "You better be careful," Mrs. Twit said, "because when I see you starting a plot, I watch you like a wombat." "Oh, do shut up, you old hag," Mr. Twit said. He went on drinking his beer, and his evil mind kept working away on the latest horrid trick he was going to play on the old woman. Suddenly, as Mr. Twit tipped the last drop of beer down his throat, he caught sight of Mrs. Twit's awful glass eye staring back at him from the bottom of the mug. It made him jump. "I told you I was watching you," cackled Mrs. Twit. "I've got eyes everywhere, so you'd better be careful." Let's start from here's the pictures. Boom, boom. We're going on to the chapter, The Frog. To pay back for her glass eye and his beer, Mr. Twit decided he would put a frog in Mrs. Twit's bed. He caught a big one down by the pond and carried it secretly back in a box. That night, when Mrs. Twit was in the bathroom getting ready for bed, Mr. Twit slipped the frog between her sheets. Then he got into his own bed and waited for the fun to begin. Mrs. Twit came back and climbed into her bed and put out the light. There she lay in the dark, scratching her tummy. Her tummy was itching. Dirty old hags like her always have itchy tummies. Then all at once she felt something cold and slimy crawling over her feet. She screamed. "What's the matter with you?" Mr. Twit said. "Help!" screamed Mrs. Twit, bouncing about. "There's something in my bed. I bet it's that giant skillywigger I saw on the floor just now." "The what?" screamed Mrs. Twit. "I tried to kill it, but I got away. Its teeth look like screwdrivers." "Help!" screamed Mrs. Twit. "Save me. It's all over my feet." "It'll bite you off your toes," said Mr. Twit. Mrs. Twit fainted. Mr. Twit got out of bed and fetched a jug of cold water. He poured the water all over Mrs. Twit's head to revive her. The frog crawled up from under the sheets to get near the water. It started jumping about the pillow. Frogs love water. This one was having a good time. When Mrs. Twit came back, the frog had jumped onto her face. This is not a nice thing to happen to anyone in bed at night," she screamed again. "By golly, it is a giant skillywigger. It will bite off your nose." Mrs. Twit leapt out of bed and flew downstairs and spent the night on the sofa. The frog went to sleep on her pillow. the wormy spaghetti. The next day, to pay back Mr. Twit back for the frog trick, Mrs. Twit sneaked out into the garden and dug up some worms. She chose big long ones and put them in a tin and carried the tin back to the house under her apron. At 1 o'clock she cooked spaghetti for lunch, and she mixed the worms in the spaghetti, but only on her husband's plate. The worms didn't show it because everything was covered in tomato sauce and sprinkled with cheese. "Hey, my spaghetti's moving," said Mr. Twit, poking it around with his fork. "It's a new kind," said Mrs. Twit, taking a mouthful from her own plate, which was, of course, had no worms. "It's called squiggly spaghetti. It's delicious. Eat it up while it's nice and hot." Mr. Twit started eating, twisting the long tomato strings covering his fork and shoveling down his mouth. Soon there was tomato sauce all over his hairy chin. "It's not as good as the ordinary kind," he said, talking with his mouth full. "It's too squishy." "I find it very tasty," Mrs. Twit said. She was watching him from the other end of the table. It gave her great pleasure to watch him eat the worms. "I find it rather bitter. It's got a distinctly bitter flavour. Buy the other kind next time." Mrs. Twit waited until Mr. Twit had eaten the whole plateful. Then she said, "Do you want to know why your spaghetti was squishy?" Mr. Twit wiped the tomato sauce from his beard with the corner of his tablecloth. "Why?" he said. "Then why it had a nasty bitter taste?" "Why?" he said. "Because it was worms," cried Mrs. Twit, clapping her hands and stomping her feet on the floor, rocking with horrible laughter. Well, that's it for today, friends, and we'll get on with the funny walking stick tomorrow.